A German shepherd, abandoned in the middle of a freezing cold night, stood alone in the snow. At 25 degrees, he shivered, desperate for help. He looked at every car that passed, but no one stopped. His hope was fading, but just when it seemed like all was lost, something shocking happened that changed everything. You won't believe what happened next. The wind bit through the night, howling like a creature of the dark as it whipped the snow into a frenzy. The air was thick with cold, a biting chill that seemed to pierce the very soul. Ace, the German shepherd, stood alone on the side of the road, his body trembling from the frigid temperatures. At 25 degrees, the snow piled up around him, and his coat, once thick and full, now looked thin and matted, weighed down by the cold. His fur, dull and patchy, barely offered any protection from the freezing wind. His ribs were visible beneath his body, his frame frail from lack of food and warmth. Ace had been wandering for hours, or was it days? Time had become a blur in the cold, dark world he found himself trapped in. Every car that passed made his heart race with hope. Maybe this time someone would stop. Maybe they'd see the desperate look in his eyes, hear the faint whimpers of a dog who had been abandoned in the middle of nowhere. His tail gave a weak wag each time he saw headlights, but they all sped past him, ignoring his silent plea for help. He was alone. No voice, no hand reached out to save him. The cold seeped into his bones, making it harder to stand, to hold on to any hope. He hadn't eaten in what felt like forever. His paws were raw from standing on the ice, and his body felt like it was failing him. But Ace refused to lie down. He couldn't. He had been abandoned, yes, but not forgotten. Someone had to be out there, someone who would care enough to help him. With every passing car, Ace's heart grew heavier. What was he doing wrong? Why was no one stopping for him? He had been a loyal dog once. He had loved his family, protected them, and yet here he was, left to die in the snow. He could still hear the sound of his owner's voice when they told him to stay, and he obeyed. But now, no one was coming back. The thought of spending the night out here, in the cold, with no warmth to shield him, began to gnaw at him. Ace shivered, his head low, his once vibrant eyes clouded with exhaustion. Would this be the end? Would he just fade away here, alone? As the minutes dragged on, he could barely lift his head anymore. The tears that welled in his eyes from the wind and the cold froze before they could even fall from his face. He tried to stand taller, tried to summon the strength to keep going, but his body wasn't cooperating. And then, a sound. For a moment, Ace's mind couldn't comprehend it. Was it the usual sound of another car passing by? No. This time, it was different. The tires screeched as the car slowed, the brake lights flashing red in the dark. Ace's heart leapt in his chest. Was it finally happening? Was someone stopping for him? The car pulled to a halt just a few feet from Ace, the engine running low. He lifted his head, his eyes bright with a sliver of hope, his body shivering not from the cold, but from the rush of emotion that surged within him. The car door opened slowly, and a figure stepped out. A man, middle-aged with a weathered face, dressed in a thick coat and gloves. For the first time in hours, Ace could smell the warmth of a human presence. He took a shaky step toward the figure, his paws scraping against the frozen ground. He could feel the heat emanating from the man's body, the scent of him, someone who could save him. The man took a few cautious steps forward, eyes locked on Ace. His face, full of concern, seemed to soften as he gazed at the shivering dog. Ace's tail gave a small, tentative wag, but then, just as Ace thought his heart might burst from the excitement, the man paused, his hand hovering near his coat pocket. And then, the words came. "I'm sorry," the man said, his voice distant, detached. "There's nothing I can do." Without another word, the man turned back toward the car, slamming the door behind him. The engine roared to life, and in seconds the car sped away, leaving Ace standing there, frozen, broken, and abandoned again. The wind howled louder now, as if mocking Ace's hope. He slumped to the ground, his body heavy with despair, and for a moment he allowed himself to give in to the cold. This was it. He had tried, but no one cared. But just as he thought the world had turned its back on him for good, there was another sound, a screeching of tires, followed by a sudden loud thud. Ace's ears perked up, and he quickly lifted his head. Was it possible? Could someone else be coming to help? He could feel the cold seeping deeper into his bones, but the sound of that thud made him look up one more time. Ace's body was frozen, his muscles stiff from the cold, but his mind was racing. His tail, once lifeless, now wagged slightly in anticipation. The loud thud that had interrupted his despair echoed in his ears. Was it the sound of someone coming to rescue him? He hadn't dared to hope for another miracle, not after the heart-wrenching rejection just moments before. But the thud, sharp and sudden, seemed to promise something more. He lifted his head and looked toward the source of the noise. The road ahead was still empty, but then a figure emerged from the shadows, walking slowly toward him. Ace's heart skipped a beat. It was another person. The footsteps were slow, steady, and filled with purpose. This time, the figure didn't seem to be in a hurry to leave. Ace took a tentative step forward, his legs shaking, unsure whether he should trust this new person. His body, weak from hunger and exhaustion, protested the movement, but his mind, filled with the desperate hope that had yet to fully die, pushed him onward. As the figure drew closer, Ace could make out more details. A man, probably in his mid-30s, wearing a dark jacket and boots, with a hat pulled low over his face. He didn't look like someone who had just passed by in a hurry. His movements were deliberate, calm, and Ace noticed the soft, focused expression on his face as he neared the dog. Ace's heart raced. Could this be it? Could this finally be the help he had been praying for? The man knelt down in front of Ace, his hands held out in a gesture of care, not fear. Ace sniffed the air, trying to catch any familiar scent. The man didn't smell like the harsh chemicals from the shelter, nor like the strangers who had walked past him. This man smelled like earth, like something real and grounding. "Hey there, boy," the man said gently, his voice warm and soothing despite the cold. "You've been out here for a while, haven't you?" Ace's eyes locked onto his, searching for any sign of deception. He was no longer sure whom to trust, but something about this stranger's calm demeanor made his doubt fade, if only for a moment. This wasn't the man who had driven off without a second glance. This man was different. Ace hesitated for a moment longer, but then the man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small packet of food. The smell wafted toward Ace, and his stomach growled in response. Though it was painful. He had barely eaten for days, and the hunger was now a constant ache that made everything feel more distant. The man opened the packet and placed a few pieces of food on the ground in front of Ace. "Here you go," the man said softly. "You look like you need this." Ace stared at the food. It wasn't much, just a few pieces of dry kibble, but to him, it was everything. The aching hunger inside him seemed to pulse with each second of hesitation, but it was more than that. It was the possibility of trust, of being cared for again. Slowly, Ace moved forward, his body shaking as he stretched his neck toward the food. His mouth was dry, but the scent of the food made his senses come alive. He didn't want to eat in front of the man. He didn't want to seem desperate, but his hunger was too strong. The man hadn't turned away. The man was giving him a chance. Ace took the food into his mouth, and it was like a flood of warmth washed over him. The food didn't fill him up, but it was enough to make him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The man smiled gently, watching him eat, as though giving Ace a moment to regain his strength. "You're a strong boy," he said quietly, his eyes soft with kindness. "You've been through a lot, huh?" Ace paused for a moment, lifting his head to meet the man's gaze. He couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to him like that, not since his old owner, who used to call him good boy and give him scratches behind the ears. The memories were fading, but that voice, the one that spoke with kindness, was like a beacon. The man slowly reached out, his hand moving carefully toward Ace's head. The dog tensed for a moment, unsure of what to expect. But then, the warmth of the man's touch rested on his ear, gentle and reassuring. Ace closed his eyes, finally allowing himself to relax. "I'm not going to leave you out here," the man promised softly. "I'm going to take care of you, okay?" And just like that, Ace knew he wasn't alone anymore. Ace couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so safe. The warmth of the stranger's touch lingered on his fur, the kindness in the man's voice still echoing in his ears. His body was still frail, but the food he had eaten filled him with a renewed sense of strength. As the man gently patted his head, Ace felt something he hadn't felt in what seemed like forever: hope. The man, whose name Ace didn't yet know, stood up and wiped his hands on his coat. He looked down at the dog, his face soft with concern. "You're going to be okay now, boy," he murmured, almost to himself. Ace stood still, watching as the man turned toward his car. Ace's eyes followed him, unsure of what would happen next. Would he be abandoned again? Would this kindness, too, vanish like the others? But the man didn't walk away. Instead, he opened the car door and gestured toward the inside. "Come on, boy. It's too cold out here. Let's get you warm." Ace hesitated. His legs trembled, but this time not from fear or weakness. It was from a spark of trust, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in so long. Slowly, he took a step forward, then another. Each step was a small victory, a quiet triumph in his battle to survive. As Ace climbed into the car, the heat from the interior enveloped him like a blanket. He was careful at first, unsure of this new place, but the warmth that surrounded him was undeniable. The car started, and the man drove off, pulling away from the place that had been Ace's prison for too long. For the first time in days, Ace finally relaxed. His eyes closed as the warmth seeped into his bones, and for a moment, he let himself forget about the past. He was no longer just the abandoned dog on the side of the road. He was something more now. He was alive, and someone cared enough to take him in. The man glanced over at Ace, his hand resting lightly on the wheel. "We'll get you checked out," he said. "I've got a friend who's a vet. You're going to be okay." Ace's ears perked up at the mention of a vet. He'd been to the vet before, but those visits had always been filled with uncertainty and fear. Would this be any different? He didn't know, but he was willing to take the chance. When they arrived at the man's home, Ace was led inside, his paws slipping slightly on the wooden floors. The house smelled different, warm and inviting, with the scent of food lingering in the air. It was nothing like the sterile, cold environments he'd known before. He was still cautious, but the sense of safety continued to grow within him. Ace was placed in a small, cozy area near a window, where a soft bed had been set up just for him. His eyes flickered between the bed and the man, as if he were waiting for permission to settle down. The man gave him a gentle smile. "Go ahead, Ace. Get some rest. You've earned it." Ace didn't need to be told twice. His tired body collapsed onto the bed, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to close his eyes. His breathing slowed, the warmth of the room wrapping around him like a comforting embrace. The next day, the man, whose name was Lucas Matthews, took Ace to the vet. The clinic was clean and smelled of antiseptic, but there was a calmness in the air that put Ace at ease. Lucas led him inside, where a friendly woman greeted them. "Looks like someone's had a rough time," she said, her voice warm and soothing. Ace was examined gently, the vet noting his thin frame and the scratches and scars on his body. But despite his condition, she reassured Lucas that Ace was strong, and with the right care, he would recover. As Lucas listened, Ace sat quietly by his side, feeling a sense of security he hadn't felt in a long time. The fear he had once carried, the fear of being abandoned and forgotten, started to fade. On the way home, Lucas spoke to Ace in soft tones, explaining that they would take it slow. "I'm not in any rush, Ace. We're going to do this together, okay?" Ace's ears perked up at the sound of his name, and for the first time, he truly believed it. He wasn't alone anymore. He had someone to trust, someone who cared. That night, as they sat together in the living room, Lucas placed a bowl of food in front of Ace. The food was fresh, the smell tantalizing. Ace sniffed it cautiously, his stomach still sore from hunger, but he no longer felt the sharp pang of desperation. He ate slowly, savoring the food as though he had just been offered a treasure. When he finished, he looked up at Lucas, his eyes filled with gratitude. Lucas smiled and reached down to pet Ace's head. "You're going to be all right, buddy. We're going to make sure of that." As Ace laid down on his bed that night, the warmth of the room and the sense of safety were like a dream come true. He no longer had to worry about survival. For the first time in so long, he could finally rest, and he would be okay. The days passed slowly, but each one brought new signs of recovery. Ace was no longer the shivering, broken dog who had been abandoned on the roadside. Each morning, when he woke up in the small, cozy room by the window, he stretched his legs with more ease. The weight of hunger, fear, and loneliness had slowly started to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of comfort he hadn't known in so long. Lucas, too, had begun to adjust to having Ace in his life. The man was patient, never pushing Ace beyond his limits, but always showing him a quiet, steady love that Ace was beginning to recognize. Their bond grew stronger each day. Lucas spoke to Ace often, explaining the simplest things to him. "It's a good day, Ace," Lucas would say with a gentle smile. "You're getting stronger." And Ace, despite his past pain, would begin to wag his tail in response. Each evening, Lucas would take him on short walks, around the yard at first, then a little further each day. Ace's legs were still weak, his movements stiff from the cold and neglect, but with each step, he felt himself growing stronger. The world was no longer a threatening place. It was a place of care, of hope. Ace was learning that, bit by bit. One particular morning, Lucas sat on the couch with a cup of coffee, watching as Ace slowly approached him. It was still early, and the soft light from the window illuminated Ace's face in a way that made the old dog look like a new animal. His fur had started to fill in. His ribs were no longer so visible, and his eyes, once so hollow and distant, now glistened with warmth. He had come a long way from that day on the road. Lucas smiled at him and set his cup down. "Come on, Ace. Let's try something new today." Ace tilted his head at the sound of his name, and a faint wag of his tail followed. Lucas stood, moving to the front door, and Ace immediately stood up as well, his movements a bit more sure than before. Lucas opened the door, the cool air from outside wafting in, and Ace hesitated at the threshold, as if unsure about crossing it. For a moment, Lucas simply stood there, waiting. He wasn't going to force him. He wanted Ace to come to his own decision. Ace's eyes glanced between Lucas and the world outside. Then, slowly, cautiously, he stepped forward. He crossed the threshold and stepped outside, his paws crunching softly against the gravel path that led to the front yard. The fresh air felt good against his face, and he lifted his nose to inhale the scent of the earth, the trees, and the flowers in the distance. It was a new world for him, one that wasn't filled with the cold bite of abandonment or the biting winds of the streets. Lucas smiled, proud of Ace's progress. "You did great, boy," he said softly. Ace turned to look up at him, his tail wagging, and for the first time, Lucas saw a spark of something in the dog's eyes. Joy. The walk was slow, but every step was filled with purpose. They wandered around the yard, Ace sniffing the flowers and exploring the grass, his movements still stiff but more confident with each step. It wasn't long before they reached the tree at the far end of the yard, and Ace, after a moment's pause, sat down in the shade, gazing out at the world with a peaceful expression on his face. Lucas took a seat next to him, his legs stretched out in front of him. He reached over and gently patted Ace's head. "You're a good boy," Lucas said, his voice full of pride. "You're going to get better every day." Ace let out a soft sigh and leaned into Lucas's hand, soaking in the affection. The connection between them was growing stronger. Lucas had given him a new chance at life, and Ace could feel the love that now surrounded him. But it wasn't just the love of Lucas that Ace was feeling. It was the love he had forgotten he could give, the love he had hidden deep inside himself, buried under the pain and fear of abandonment. Later that afternoon, Lucas returned to the backyard with a ball, a simple red rubber ball that he had picked up from a store a few days before. He held it in front of Ace, who immediately perked up at the sight of it. "What do you think, boy? Wanna play?" Ace's ears perked up, and for the first time in so long, a deep, excited bark came from his throat. He bounced on his paws, wagging his tail in anticipation. He didn't need to be told twice. Lucas tossed the ball a few feet ahead, and Ace bolted after it, his legs moving with newfound strength and energy. He grabbed the ball in his mouth and trotted back to Lucas, dropping it at his feet. "Good boy," Lucas laughed, and for a moment, everything felt right. The bond between them had strengthened, and Ace had found his place in this new world, with someone who cared, someone who would never leave him behind. For the first time in a long time, Ace felt whole again. He wasn't the abandoned dog anymore. He was Ace, a dog who had found a new life and a new family, where love and trust filled the spaces where emptiness once resided. Ace had never known what it was like to feel truly safe, but now, every day that passed seemed to bring him closer to understanding that this wasn't just a moment of reprieve. It was the beginning of a new life. With Lucas, he had a routine, meals at the same time every day, walks around the yard, and plenty of time to rest. But more than that, Ace was learning something he hadn't realized he'd been missing: trust. Lucas had become more than just his rescuer. He had become his family. There were no more cold nights spent alone, no more harsh winds biting at his bones. Now, Ace had someone who would be there, no matter what. And in return, Ace offered Lucas his loyalty, his companionship, and the love that had been buried under years of fear and neglect. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. Ace's body had started to fill out, his ribs less visible beneath his coat. His fur was still patchy in places, but it was thickening and shining with health. The deep sadness in his eyes had started to soften, replaced by a look of quiet contentment. His movements were no longer stiff with pain, and though he wasn't quite as energetic as he had been in his youth, there was a noticeable lightness in his step. One afternoon, Lucas had just finished mowing the lawn when he saw Ace, standing in the doorway, watching him. There was something different about the way Ace was looking at him today, something deeper. "Hey, boy," Lucas called out, his voice full of warmth. He stopped what he was doing and made his way over to Ace. "What's going on?" Ace didn't move at first, but as Lucas got closer, he could see it. The dog's eyes were sparkling with anticipation, and his tail was wagging. It was the same tail that had once been limp and lifeless, but now it was full of energy, responding to the joy in the air. Without warning, Ace bounded toward him. It wasn't the careful, slow approach of a dog who had been neglected. It was the confident, eager leap of a dog who had found his place, who had found his home. Lucas laughed as Ace reached him, his tail wagging furiously. "What's the matter, huh? You want to play?" he asked, bending down to rub Ace's head. Ace barked happily, his body jumping up and down in excitement. He had always been a dog of energy, of action, but now that energy was being used for something good, something positive. Lucas grinned and pulled a ball from his pocket. "All right, Ace, you're on." He tossed the ball across the yard, and without hesitation, Ace darted after it, his legs strong and quick. Lucas watched as the dog ran, a joy he hadn't seen before radiating from his every step. This wasn't just a dog running for a ball. This was a dog who had found his spirit again, a dog who had been given a second chance. When Ace brought the ball back, Lucas took it and threw it again. Ace was more than willing to keep playing. He darted across the yard, each movement a display of newfound strength and agility. As the sun began to set, Lucas slowed down, sitting on the porch steps and catching his breath. Ace sat next to him, his tongue hanging out, panting happily. They sat there together, in the cool evening air, watching the colors of the sunset stretch across the sky. Lucas turned to Ace, his eyes filled with pride. "You're something else, aren't you?" he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Ace looked up at him, his eyes soft but steady. He nudged Lucas's hand with his nose, and Lucas smiled, reaching down to pet him. "You're home now, Ace. You're finally home." For the first time, Ace really understood what that meant. Over the next few weeks, Ace's transformation continued. He began to interact more with Lucas, following him around the house, sitting by his feet as he worked on various projects. When Lucas went to the grocery store, Ace was always waiting by the door, his tail wagging eagerly as if to say, "I'll wait for you." One evening, after dinner, Lucas sat down on the couch with Ace by his side. He rested his arm on the back of the couch and let out a sigh of contentment. "You know, Ace," Lucas began, his voice low, "I never thought I'd be here, doing this. But something about you've helped me more than you know. You gave me a reason to keep going." Ace's ears perked up at the sound of his name. He nudged Lucas's arm gently, as though to remind him that they were in this together. Lucas smiled, rubbing Ace's head. "You've taught me more about loyalty and love than I ever thought possible. I think we're both lucky, don't you?" Ace's tail wagged softly, and he settled his head on Lucas's lap, his eyes closing in contentment. For the first time in so long, Ace was truly happy. He had found the love and care he needed, and in return, he gave everything he had to Lucas. As the weeks passed, Ace's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Every day, he grew stronger, his body filling out and his fur growing back in patches. His eyes, once dull and filled with the sorrow of abandonment, now sparkled with life. He was no longer the scared, hungry dog on the side of the road. He had found his purpose, his place in this world. Lucas could see the change in Ace every single day, the way he moved, the way his tail wagged a little more with each passing hour, the way his eyes would follow Lucas with an unspoken understanding of trust. Ace had not only healed physically, he was healing emotionally too, and in return, Lucas found himself more connected to Ace than he ever thought possible. One evening, after dinner, Lucas was sitting on the couch, a book in his hands, but his mind wandered. He couldn't stop thinking about the day he found Ace, the cold, heart-wrenching sight of the abandoned dog on the side of the road, waiting for someone to care. The memory still haunted him, but now, with Ace by his side, the pain of that memory had been replaced with a sense of purpose and peace. Ace lay at his feet, his head resting on the ground, his eyes half closed. The dog's presence was a constant reminder of how far they had both come since that cold, lonely night. "Hey, buddy," Lucas said softly, putting the book down. Ace perked up at the sound of his name, his ears lifting slightly. Lucas smiled and reached down to scratch the dog behind the ears. "You've come a long way, haven't you?" Ace's tail thumped softly on the floor in response, and Lucas chuckled. "You're something else, Ace. A real survivor." Ace didn't need words to understand what Lucas meant. The bond they shared was beyond words. It was a connection forged through time, trust, and mutual respect. A few days later, Lucas decided to take Ace on a longer walk than usual. The weather had started to warm up, and the soft spring breeze felt good against their skin. Ace had been more energetic lately, his legs strong, his movements quicker. Lucas had no doubt that this was their time to step into the world outside of the house, to test Ace's progress and see how far he had truly come. Lucas led Ace down the street, the dog walking confidently at his side. Every so often, Ace would look up at Lucas, his eyes steady and calm. It was a look of trust, a look that said, "I know you won't leave me." And for Lucas, it was a reminder of the promise he had made, to always be there for Ace, to never let him go. As they reached the park, Lucas found a bench and sat down, letting Ace wander around the open field. The dog sniffed the grass, chased after a few birds, and even rolled in the dirt, clearly enjoying the freedom. For a moment, Lucas watched him, his heart swelling with pride. Ace was more than just a dog. He was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even after the hardest of times, there is always the chance for new beginnings. "Good boy," Lucas called, and Ace bounded back to him, his tail wagging happily. Lucas reached down, giving Ace a well-deserved scratch on the head. "You're one hell of a dog." Ace barked happily in response, his energy renewed. The bond between them was stronger than ever. Lucas had saved Ace, but Ace had saved Lucas in return. They were a team. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Lucas and Ace sat together on the bench, enjoying the peaceful moment. The world around them seemed to slow down, the hustle and bustle of life fading away. It was just the two of them, sharing this moment of serenity and understanding. "You know," Lucas said, his voice soft but filled with certainty, "I never thought I'd end up here, with you. But I'm glad I did. I'm glad you're here with me." Ace looked up at him, his eyes full of trust and affection. He leaned his head against Lucas's leg, and Lucas smiled, his hand gently resting on Ace's back. "I'll always be here for you, Ace. You're not alone anymore." Ace sighed contentedly, his body relaxing against Lucas's side. The weight of the world no longer felt so heavy for either of them. Together, they had created a new beginning, one that was built on the foundation of trust, loyalty, and love. And in that moment, with the setting sun casting its warm glow over them, Lucas knew that Ace was home. The days had stretched into weeks, and the weeks had turned into months. Ace had changed in ways that Lucas hadn't even imagined. The dog who had been abandoned in the cold, trembling, and hopeless, was now a vibrant, loyal companion. His fur was thick and shiny, his eyes full of life, and his heart had been healed, just as Lucas's had been. Their bond was unspoken but unbreakable. Every day, Lucas found new ways to show Ace that he was loved, and Ace responded in kind, his actions speaking louder than any words could. But there was something Lucas had been thinking about for a while now, something that felt right, something he knew would complete their journey together. It was time for Ace to experience something he had never known, a true, permanent home. Lucas had moved into his house not long ago, a small, quiet place on the edge of town. It was nothing fancy, but it had everything he and Ace needed. But Lucas knew it wasn't just about the house. It was about the life they had built together. And as he looked at Ace, lying contentedly at his feet, he realized it was time to make this life official. One afternoon, as they sat in the living room, Lucas reached for his phone. He had been considering this decision for some time. But now, as he looked at Ace, he felt sure. "You ready, Ace?" Lucas asked softly, his voice filled with excitement and love. Ace lifted his head and looked at him with those deep, trusting eyes. His tail wagged gently in response, and Lucas smiled, his heart swelling. Without another word, Lucas dialed the number he had been meaning to call. It was time to give Ace the future he deserved, the future they both deserved. The call was brief, but as soon as Lucas hung up, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He stood up and walked to the door, holding out his hand to Ace. "Come on, boy," he said. "Let's go get you a collar." Ace, ever eager to please, jumped up and bounded toward him. The two of them walked out the door, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow on everything around them. As they walked into town, Lucas couldn't help but notice how far Ace had come. The once fragile dog, with his thin coat and hollow eyes, was now walking proudly beside him. He was no longer the stray dog searching for food and warmth. He was home. They reached the pet store, and Lucas could see Ace's eyes light up as they walked through the door. There were so many new smells, so many new sights for him to experience. Lucas led Ace to the collar section, picking out a simple, sturdy one with a tag that would carry their address and contact information. "You've come a long way, Ace," Lucas said, fitting the collar around the dog's neck. "This is your collar, this is your home, and this is your family." Ace looked up at him, his tail wagging energetically, as though he understood every word. This was his moment. This collar wasn't just a piece of leather or fabric. It symbolized everything they had gone through together. As they left the store and walked back home, Lucas couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of pride. He had given Ace a chance at a new life, but in return, Ace had given him something he had lost along the way: hope. That night, as they sat together on the couch, Ace resting his head on Lucas's lap, the world outside seemed distant. There were no more cold nights spent alone. There was no more hunger or fear. There was only the quiet contentment of two souls who had found each other in the most unlikely of places. "Thank you for everything, Ace," Lucas whispered, his hand resting gently on the dog's head. "I couldn't have asked for a better friend." Ace's eyes softened, and he closed them, letting out a deep sigh of contentment. He had everything he needed now: a home, a family, and the love he had always craved. Lucas smiled, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. In that moment, he realized that their story was one of transformation, a journey of healing, not just for Ace, but for him too. Together, they had found a way to move forward, to leave behind the pain of the past, and to embrace the future. As they sat in the stillness of the night, Lucas knew that Ace had finally found his forever home, and that he had found a loyal companion for life. Ace's journey from abandonment to a loving home is a true testament to resilience and hope. From the cold streets to a family that truly cares, Ace has found his forever home, and so has Lucas. They are no longer two strangers, but a family built on trust, love, and second chances. If Ace's story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes in the power of second chances. Let's spread love and hope, one story at a time.